Welcome back to the Brown Word, and we are going to see how Joseph deals with the rest of the famine because in the midst of moving his family, I think we kind of lose track of the fact that we're still in the famine time. We're still in the 7 years of famine. And so that is definitely still the case. So go back to Genesis chapter 47 with me. We're going to finish out the chapter today. We're going to start with verse 13. So let's see how Joseph responds as things get a little bit trickier as we go along. Verse 13. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." So at this point, the first part of the first thing to go would be money, right? So that makes sense if you're buying food. That makes sense to see that go first. But what happens if you are in a years long famine and the money runs out, and not just your money, but your neighbor's money and their neighbors? And I mean, what happens when that happens? It can be very devastating. And so they, of course, come to Joseph and say, "Look, we're going to die, and we shouldn't have to because we had those 7 years of abundance. So don't we have enough?" And yes, they do, but their money is gone. And so Joseph now has to find out or figure out another way that they can get the food that is there. Because some people would say, okay, why didn't he just give out the food? Because if he was trying to save lives, why didn't he just give out the food just without any sort of compensation? And he could, but I think he's making the wiser choice, because if he's just going to give out the food just without any compensation, then how is he supposed to keep track, and how is he supposed to quote unquote ration, but really structure the amount of food that is given out if you just give it out willy nilly? Like, there has to be at least some sort of compensation where you can keep track of things. And so he comes up with an idea. Verse 16. And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord by our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So, the idea that Joseph comes up with in his wisdom, which again, the wisdom that Joseph has is from the Lord. Don't separate that. The wisdom that Joseph has here is directly from the Lord. And I think that's really, really important to see, is that the wisdom that Joseph shows here is not just his own, even though he has become a very wise individual, and his character has certainly, wisdom has certainly become a character attribute of Joseph during this time. But here, it's to be implied that the wisdom of the Lord is the wisdom that Joseph is having. So he asked to all the livestock to be given to Pharaoh, and so they continue to, uh, yeah, so they continue to survive. Now, some people will say, well, couldn't you use livestock as food? Yes, but the livestock mainly are used to as tools or vessels um, to in agriculture. And the problem is that during this time of famine, you literally could not grow anything, which was the whole entire point of the vision in Pharaoh's dream, was the fact that there would be 7 years where it's almost like you could do the sloppiest job of planting, which I'm not a good gardener. I could even flourish during the 7 years of abundance, and I am not a good gardener at all. I don't really do well with keeping plants. So with that being said, you, but this time of abundance, anybody could prosper when it comes to agriculture. But then when it comes to the famine, though, even a expert in agriculture could not grow a single thing. And so you see the two extremes. The time of abundance is abundance, but the time of famine is truly famine. And it's not like there were like pockets of Egypt that were good for agriculture. No, nothing was. And not just Egypt, but anywhere. And so that's the problem that you have on your hands. So livestock, in a way, become almost not not purposeless, but they become irrelevant. And so because of that, it's very easy to make this trade. But then what happens when that runs out? And so, which it does, it lasts a year, but then that runs out. So, what do you do now? Well, now you have to give up the only thing you have left, which is your land. Now, here's the one thing it does say up giving up their bodies. So, and it says in verse 19, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. Now, some have thought that Joseph is like this, basically, he's condoning slavery. That's not exactly what's going on here. The people that are being quote unquote servants to Pharaoh are exactly that. It's just a servanthood, not slavery. They still have all their rights as human beings. They are still getting at least some sort of compensation, which in this case is food. So, and they are not having to worry about paying for their land because they've given their land to Pharaoh. But this is also a moment where Joseph shows his importance to, and is again more of that wisdom to Pharaoh. So let's see how this all comes together, this idea of servanthood. Verse 20. So Joseph brought, so Joseph bought, sorry. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields, because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priest he did not buy, for the priest had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. And so there's a couple things interesting here. So again, my from what I can tell from verse 21, as for the people who made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other, which he it also can be interpreted he removed them to the cities. Basically, he is having them put all of their faith and trust in Pharaoh and in Joseph too, that they survive during this time of famine. And so when it says that they become servants, again, I don't see slavery here where they lose their identity and where they become meaningless to Pharaoh. Pharaoh continues to love them and to um, be a source of income to them. Again, not money wise, but food wise. And so I don't see slavery here. I just see a time of servanthood um, where they are bound to Pharaoh, where they are. Where they are giving their trust over to Pharaoh. And um, with the help of the wisdom of Joseph, it sees them through basically. So, with that being said, the other thing that's interesting, I think, is the fact that Israel is not mentioned here. So the land of Goshen is not brought up here. Now you could say, okay, it's possible that they're lumped in here, but I think what's interesting is verse 20 is for all the Egyptians sold their fields, and then verse 21, as for the people. I think people there probably uh, probably refers to the Egyptians exclusively. That's my guess. I'm not entirely sure on that, but when it comes down to verse 27 talking about Goshen, it doesn't seem like they are under um, the same servanthood, which is interesting because obviously later on in the book of Exodus, they don't go to servanthood, they go to slavery in the country of Egypt. So I think that's interesting to see or possibly to hint at in that section there. Verse 23, then Joseph said to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones. And they said, you have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh. So Joseph made a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So this is interesting because at first I thought that this famine was completely just, you could not do anything. And yet, in verses 23 through 26, they could. So what's going on here? I think that for a time, the Lord, or it could be that this is the end of the famine itself, because what's interesting in chapters 48, 49, and 50, we really don't hear much about the famine anymore. And so with that being said, I think it's interesting to see that this is kind of the last part of the famine that we hear about. So my guess is at this point, either the famine is ended or it's about to end, and you start seeing some signs of life, basically. So I think that's possibly what's going on. It's hard to tell because, again, the term famine, especially a famine on this scale, you would think nothing would be able to be done. And yet, that's not the case. But again, I don't see a slavery background here. I see more of we are putting our trust in Pharaoh. And then, two, in verse 26, when it comes to the statute about Pharaoh having a fifth of the land from then on out, it's not that Pharaoh just keeps the land forever after this point. I think the land is given directly back to the people of Egypt. But, I mean, after a period of time, I'm sure they had to buy it back, probably, hopefully, a discount rate. But I think that's important to see too. Now, again, I believe that Israel did not really have to go through all this because of verse 27 and 28 as well. Um, Verse 27, thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And so I think that verse alone shows you that the selling of land to Pharaoh, I don't think that exists here. Now, granted, Goshen was given as a gift to Israel, but or to Jacob and his family, but I don't see any sort of point where, okay, now you have to give it back to us. You know what I mean? So I think that's interesting. And then verse 28, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. So he lives in Egypt for the last 17 years of his life. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, in verse 29, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. Now, the end of verse 31, when I first heard that, I'm like, oh my gosh, he literally just died. But it's basically just showing the fact that he's about to. And then in this weird kind of, instead of a pinky swear, it's this thigh swear, which is very, very odd, but it's very cultural. And so this would have been very normal. It would have been a sign of respect and honor for an older an older statesman, basically. And so I think that is interesting. But what's more interesting is the fact that he knows that he is still very much part of his family line and his family land in Canaan. So he does not want to be buried in Egypt, but he wants to be taken back to Canaan. But from this point, though, he does then spend some time blessing and passing on wisdom to his sons and then and grandsons as well. So we're going to look at that next time in chapter 48. We're going to see how Jacob blesses the grandsons of Joseph and how Joseph responds to it. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. But here again, you see the wisdom of the Lord come directly through Joseph. And I think when we are struggling with times of not necessarily actual famine, but when we are struggling with times of just what do I do next? What do I do next? God's not literally asking you to give away everything that you have, give away yourself to the church where you just constantly serve. Like when it comes to, yeah, like you're always at the church, even though that would be interesting. But of course, he's not asking that of every single minute of your life. But he is asking you to trust him and to depend on him to give you what you need. And really giving you what you need, I think, is an interesting theme to the life of Joseph. I think that's something that we really should focus on when it comes to the life and the character of Joseph. So with that being said, I mean, obviously, when I made that point, obviously, we want to give our heart and our soul to the Lord. I'm just saying that The Lord wants us to depend on him. He doesn't need the material things that we have. It's not like he needs those things. He wants and longs for a relationship with you and I, which is why he sent Jesus, right? So I think that's really, really important to see. But I will see you next time to see how Jacob blesses Joseph's grandchildren. Thanks. Or Joseph's children, sorry. Thanks.